Hello and welcome to Cold Wars and Beyond, Part 10. Now we will look at some of the key events and changes in Africa and the Middle East primarily from the 1970s to current times. The populations in predominantly sub-Saharan Africa have faced major problems since the age of imperialism. Even before the Europeans arrived, most African societies were organized along tribal lines. After decolonization, many African states devolved into dictatorships or one-party democracies, far from ideal. Due to brain drain, most of the well-educated and well-off Africans have made their way to the core states, limiting the opportunities within the continent. Furthermore, Europe's interests in Africa were their own, seeking to exploit the Africans and not modernize them. The infrastructure was designed for the extraction of minerals and resources through roads, rail, canals, and such, emanating from the interior to the seaports, in many cases bypassing entire communities. The new nations were burdened with economies dominated by a single crop or single mineral, working against economic diversification, and making them susceptible to fluctuating markets. As such, sub-Saharan Africa remains one of the most impoverished regions on the globe, with low levels of health, wealth, and education. They have been adversely affected by diseases such as malaria and HIV/AIDS. Nonetheless, some of the fastest growing economies are in Africa. Of course, keep in mind, the growth rate is measured in percentage, not overall wealth. With that in mind, these countries still have a long way to go. An intriguing story is that of South Africa, which in 1948 set up the system of apartheid or apartness in Afrikaans. Apartheid established forced segregation among four classes: the Bantu, or the blacks, who made up more than 3/4 of the population. Then there were the coloreds, or the mixed races, the Asians, and then the whites at the top. The blacks were relegated to Bantustans, which were homelands for the blacks, comprising no more than 10% of the total land area. No intermarriage between races was allowed, and the blacks had to carry identity passes with them at all times. Additionally, they were limited to menial jobs and faced oppression and brutality often. And South Africa became fully independent in 1961. The ANC, or African National Congress, pushed for African rights. Nelson Mandela was one of the key leaders of this party, and largely promoted non-violent non-cooperation inspired by Mohandas Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. However, this changed after the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, with police firing on a crowd of demonstrators and killing almost 70. Mandela and others then engaged in sabotage against military and government targets, and Mandela was sent to prison from 1964 to 1990. In 1989, a new president, F.W. de Klerk, repealed the identity pass laws, legalized the ANC, and ordered Mandela's release. Apartheid was abolished through several new laws passed between 1990 and 1994. And in 1994, South Africa held its first multiracial elections. Mandela was elected president and called on the people to heal the wounds of the past. He served as president until 1999 and died in 2013. Looking at South Africa's country data, it meets the criteria of an NIC, despite its low life expectancy, a number strongly related to the HIV/AIDS epidemic plaguing the country. Another African state to briefly overview is Nigeria. It is the most populous state in Africa and had been hindered by sectarian division and violence for generations, between the largely Muslim North and the largely Christian and traditional South. In 1991, they moved their capital from Lagos, their largest city, to a more interior and neutral location in Abuja, making it a forward capital. This was done to also hopefully relieve some of the population pressure and overcrowding along the coast, and also help to improve the less well-developed areas of the country. Nigeria has also been ruled by military dictatorships time and again. To give some perspective, the first civilian-to-civilian transfer of power in the country's history took place in 2007. The government continues to face the daunting task of diversifying their petroleum-based economy, whose profits have been squandered through corruption and mismanagement. And looking at their country data, Nigeria is still an LDC. Now we'll move our attention from Africa to the Middle East, also known as Southwest Asia, a largely Muslim region, but also one of great strategic value in terms of resources and geography. Now, looking at Iran in the 1970s, their leader, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, had been in power since 1941. He worked to modernize and secularize his country, separating religion from the government. This did come at a cost, upsetting the Shiite fundamentalists and leading the Shah to suppress dissenters using secret police and authoritarian tactics. Then, in 1979, a conservative cleric, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, led a revolution and overthrew the Shah, who then fled for his life. Khomeini then proceeded to create a strict Islamic theocracy. Now, the Shah was admitted to a hospital in the US for cancer treatment, and the Iranians demanded that he be handed over to them for trial. After the Americans refused, militants attacked and broke into the US Embassy in the capital, Tehran, and seized 52 American hostages. In 1980, the US attempted to rescue the hostages through a commando raid, but they got caught in a sandstorm. Then, disaster struck when a helicopter crashed into a transport aircraft, killing 8 American servicemen. The hostages were not released until 1981 after Ronald Reagan took office. Now, in 1979, Saddam Hussein took control of Iraq, beginning a reign of terror. To give perspective on his leadership style, one of his idols was Joseph Stalin. Saddam had ambitions of westernizing Iraq, and after a history of border disputes with Iran, Iraqi armed forces invaded a disputed waterway in 1980. This was a definitional and locational boundary dispute, and this began the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988. Iraq received foreign weapons and loans from countries like China, Great Britain, and even the United States. The Iranians used human wave attacks, even using thousands of children called the Basij, who would march in front of other troops as human shields, and were even used to clear landmines in some cases. The war ended essentially in a draw, with no real changes in borders. However, there were more than 500,000 military deaths, mostly on the Iranian side. There were also perhaps as many civilian deaths as well. It has been considered one of the most useless wars in modern times. Afterward, both countries' economies were in shambles, and Saddam's ambitions were not settled. In 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, claiming historical rights to territory. This was also an allocational boundary dispute over an oil field that crossed between their borders. It was this action that initiated the Persian Gulf War. The United Nations imposed economic sanctions, and a 34-country coalition of more than 600,000 troops was mobilized in Saudi Arabia in what was known as Desert Shield. In 1991, the US began a 40-day campaign of airstrikes known as Desert Storm. Ground troops followed afterward, and the largely US-led forces quickly overwhelmed the Iraqis within 4 days. The capital, Baghdad, however, was not taken. A ceasefire was brokered by the UN, and Saddam Hussein remained in power. Now, for many extremists in the Middle East, the United States has been called the Great Satan because of its support of Israel and for its culture that runs counter to their fundamentalist views. Enter Osama bin Laden. He had offered King Fahd of Saudi Arabia the protection of his mujahideen before the king accepted UN support. Bin Laden had founded Al-Qaeda, meaning the base, in the late 1980s during the Soviet-Afghan War. He and his followers wanted to wage a global jihad, meaning holy war, and they wanted to return to strict Sharia law. The Western forces stationed so close to the holy sites of Mecca and Medina were seen as a treachery. And so began a series of attacks against the West, and especially the United States. In 1993, they detonated a truck bomb in the North Tower garage of the World Trade Center in New York City. The goal was to topple both towers. While this didn't happen, 6 people were killed and many more were injured. In 1998, around the 8th anniversary of the arrival of American forces in Saudi Arabia, Al-Qaeda bombed US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. Hundreds of people were killed in the attacks. In 2000, Al-Qaeda used a small boat for a suicide attack against the USS Cole while harbored at a Yemeni port. 17 US servicemen were killed and 39 more were injured. Now, in 1996, a fundamentalist group called the Taliban, supported by several people within the Pakistani government, seized power in Afghanistan through military force. The Taliban then created a strict Islamic government based on Sharia law. During their time in power, mutilations and executions for offenses became more prevalent. Women were banned from employment and girls were not allowed to be educated. And the Taliban worked to destroy anything that was non-Muslim. The Taliban also provided a safe haven for bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Then, on September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda launched a series of attacks against the United States. 19 terrorists hijacked 4 commercial jets and deliberately crashed them into both towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, eventually collapsing them both. The Pentagon in Washington, D.C. was also hit by one of the planes, and a 4th plane crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Some of the passengers had called friends and family who told them what was happening. Many tried to overpower the terrorists, resulting in the crash, but preventing the plane from hitting either the White House or the Capitol building in Washington. All told, more than 3,000 people were killed that day. The US demanded the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden and expel Al-Qaeda. After they refused, the US declared war and invaded Afghanistan with the assistance of NATO forces. Most of the fighting was over by the end of 2001. In the early 2000s, the United States and United Kingdom believed Iraq had or was developing WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction, meaning chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. Iraq was also under sanctions and repeatedly broke many UN resolutions. In 2003, the United States and the United Kingdom invaded Iraq with 47 other countries lending support. Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, fell within 3 weeks. Saddam Hussein's sons died in the fighting, and by the end of the year, he was captured. In 2006, he was tried and hanged. This brought an end to his brutal regime. Several reports concluded that Iraq had no active weapons programs at the time of the invasion, but they intended to resume production if sanctions were lifted. As the saying goes, a leopard doesn't change its spots. Saddam's legacy was a terrible one. He lived lavishly and terrorized his own people for decades. Hundreds of thousands of mass graves were uncovered in the years following. While the US defeated Iraq's army quite easily, winning the peace was much more difficult. An insurgency against the Americans ensued, with insurgents using guerrilla tactics and IEDs, or improvised explosive devices. These were roadside bombs used against American vehicles. The United States slowly turned over military control to Iraq's new democratic government and finally left Iraq in 2011. Also in 2011, Osama bin Laden was killed in his compound in Pakistan by a Navy SEAL team. The US has still not completely left Afghanistan as of 2014.